Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 206, Henry VII. Last time we had a little refresher from our Wars of the Roses episodes. Henry Tudor, amazingly, won at the Battle of Bosworth Field and became Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty. But his claim to the throne was tenuous at best, and he knew it. Henry spent the first decade plus of his reign dealing with a myriad of pretenders and challengers to the throne. What that first decade taught Henry was that he did not have the luxury of trust. Outside his tiny circle of supporters, gathered together in his closed, secret Privy Council, he would not trust anyone, not one single inch. But it wasn't all bad news. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York had proved fruitful. Henry had not one but two sons, Arthur and a new Henry. In this episode, Henry tries to enter the European stage and forge marriage alliances, using his children as pawns in the game of European politics. The way was now paved for a spectacular royal wedding between England and Spain. This had been Henry's goal for some time. Sure, all the pretenders got in the way, but now that they had been dealt with, Henry could turn his attention fully to his dynastic ambitions. His plan was simple: wed Arthur to the first daughter of Spain, Catherine of Aragon. By November 1501, Catherine was in England and preparing to enter London. Everything seemed prepared. Oh, if only that young girl knew the extent of the trials before her. Prince Arthur's marriage to Catherine had actually been brokered all the way back in 1489 and was the culmination of Henry's ambitions. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, had united Spain, finally thrust the Moors across the Straits of Gibraltar, and now, at least according to the Pope, ruled over the entire New World, save Brazil. Not that they understood that yet. The marriage festivities were set to last for 2 weeks. After the marriage, the plan was to sail around the Thames from palace to palace for a fortnight, until the whole thing ended at Henry's new palace of Richmond, rushed to completion in time for Catherine's arrival. London was a microcosm of English public life. Over the centuries, the interests of the Crown and London more or less settled to an easy symbiosis. In exchange for massive loans, the perennially cash-strapped kings of England granted London privileges of self-government and trade protection. Moreover, as the English royal house grew less and less mobile, it settled into a series of houses strung out over the river, each within easy reach of Westminster. Royal servants became a part of the fabric of city life, sometimes accumulating business interests and mingling with mercantile elite. Under Henry, at least up to 1501, this relationship had, more or less, continued to prosper. I do mean more or less, however. Henry's relationship with London was a bit more antagonistic than had been the case with previous kings. Henry was determined to enforce his prerogatives. London jealously guarded its liberties. Trying to take advantage, Henry was fond of making examples of any merchant who stepped over the line, levying massive fines against any transgressors. And he constantly played the different guilds off of one another. During the height of the Warbeck controversy, Henry had enforced a total trade embargo with the Low Countries in an effort to force Maximilian to give up the Pretender. It didn't work, as you know, but it did infuriate the London guilds. Making matters worse, when trade resumed, Henry chose the new governor of the England Merchant Adventurers in Bruges, a privilege previously reserved for the city. Highly suspicious of the city's independence and covetous of its wealth, Henry was always looking for opportunities to tighten his grip. But in general, Henry and his counselors were alert to London's importance in raising funds and maintaining order. As a result, cozy relationships between city leaders and members of the King's Privy Council quickly developed. London remained the showpiece of the kingdom and its chief sponsor of triumphs and celebrations. London was where the Tudor monarchs could show off. Kings tended to leave the arrangements of major celebrations in the hands of the city magistrates. After all, it was working. But in November 1499, Henry informed said magistrates of a change. The mayor was required to appoint an 8-person committee to communicate with the Privy Council about Catherine's reception into the city. In essence, he was making London a sub-department of the royal household. Oh, and did I mention it would be required to foot a huge bill for the privilege? The wedding and reception would highlight Henry's chief source of political capital, his sons. In Arthur and Henry, their father had two highly contrasting focal points. The two were as different as night and day. Arthur took after his father. He liked the quiet enclosed spaces of court and household. Henry, on the other hand, loved a show. He was already proving to be a master of public spectacle. At only 3 years old, he had ridden through London on a horse. But Henry's charisma was not the only or even most important reason that he was assigned a major place at the wedding. He was the Duke of York, and everyone needed to see that. In Henry VII's New England, York and Lancaster were united, and Prince Henry remained another example of said union. The road getting to this point had not been entirely smooth. Prior to Catherine's arrival, London was hit with a major epidemic of plague, which carried off as much as 1/3 to 1/2 of the city's population. It was a grim reminder that Yersinia pestis was a cyclical threat. One such victim of the plague was 80-year-old John Morton, almost to the end, the supreme architect of Henry's reign. Morton had been a lawyer, politician, administrator, and archbishop. He had done it all for Henry, and he had managed royal affairs with a perfect combination of daring and adaptability. The marriage between Arthur and Catherine had been one of his brainchildren. He was easily the most influential of Henry's close advisors. And now he was gone. Spring 1501 brought further delays, this time in Spain. Ferdinand had his hands full quelling Moorish resistance, and Catherine herself had fallen ill. But finally, by early summer, she was ready, and by August she was on her way to England. However, at the same time, while Catherine's ship made its way to the cliffs of Dover, Another ship was heading the opposite direction. This ship was carrying Edmund de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk. He and his small band of supporters. Suffolk had, arguably, a better claim to the throne than Henry did. After some initial chafing, Henry believed that Suffolk had been successfully co-opted into the new regime. Henry was wrong. Suffolk's white rose would not so easily be grafted onto the red one. And Suffolk's flight would leave Henry with a headache and issues he would need to deal with for almost the entire rest of his reign. If we go back in time for a second, 2 years prior, Suffolk returned to court with the expectation that he would be able to regain his dead father's titles and lands. He should have known better. Henry was more than happy to trot him out like a show pony when grand affairs of state required that special show of unity. But Henry never trusted Suffolk. He was the son, in Henry's opinion, of a traitor, Suffolk having fought against him at Bosworth Field, and he was a hated Yorkist at that. By the time that the 16th century dawned, the younger Suffolk was of the opinion that things had gone from bad to worst. His decline in East Anglia was exacerbated by the rise of 2 men. The first was Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey. Surrey, like Suffolk, had been on the losing side at Bosworth, but he had worked tirelessly to restore his family's fortunes and get back in Henry's good graces. He campaigned on Henry's behalf against the Scots and supported the Tudor dynasty in every way that he could. Now he was encroaching on what should have been Suffolk's sphere of influence. The other man was Edward Stafford, the young Duke of Buckingham. Everyone at court fell over themselves to get near the dashing, well-dressed young duke. All this served to do was to push the brooding Suffolk further into the shadows. Now, in the weeks and days leading up to Suffolk's flight from England, Henry's advisors consistently warned him that something was afoot. Henry began to doubt himself that he should have spared Suffolk at all. But he acted too late, and Suffolk escaped his grasp. When Henry investigated the matter further, he found, once again, that the conspiracy had roots that went far deeper than he expected, involving powerful enemies from within and without. Suffolk's disappearance made the wedding festivities all the more important to Henry's plans. More than ever, he needed to drive home the message of dynastic magnificence, power, and above all, permanence. The last thing Henry wanted was for Suffolk to appear back on English soil with a new army and support at home. It would be Bosworth Field all over again. And Henry knew how well that went for the king the last time. As October 1501 drew to a close, Henry received word that Catherine had finally arrived in England. Landing in Plymouth, she made her way through southern England as part of the stately procession I already described. Through persistent October and November rains, the Spanish retinue continued its slow journey toward London. On November 12, 1501, Catherine finally reached England's most important city. She met Arthur for the first time and proceeded to enter London, blessed then by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Afterwards, the royal couple parted ways, Catherine to the north side of St. Paul's and Arthur to London's southwest suburbs. The following day, the king received the Spanish ambassadors at Baynard's Castle, one of his new residences on the Thames, to confirm the details. The following day, November 14th, 1501, was the day of the wedding. St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the finest in all of Europe, had been lavishly transformed inside. Its walls were hung with tapestries. Under its stained glass rose window, the high altar glinted with gold plate, ornaments, and holy relics encrusted with precious stones. From the west door, an elevated walkway covered in red cloth stretched the length of the cathedral, around 600 feet, to a rounded stage where the entire ceremony was to take place. The idea was to create something that looked like a mountain, and according to all the witnesses, it did the job. As Catherine and Prince Henry paraded down the walkway, Arthur appeared on the stage. Obviously, Ferdinand and Isabella were not present for the ceremony, so the young prince had the task of walking the bride down the aisle. The ceremony itself lasted 3 hours. When it drew to a close, the brass section erupted into thunderous music. The newlyweds turned, hand in hand, and faced the hundreds inside who had come to witness their union. It truly was the dawning of a new age. The couple then separated and made their way, each with their own procession, to the bishop's palace for a brief celebratory mass and festivities. The wedding feast, as was expected, stretched on until 5 in the evening and was followed by more drinking and entertainment. Between 7 and 8 in the evening, Arthur was playfully dragged off by the Earl of Oxford, overseer of the nuptial engagements. Arthur found Catherine already laying in bed waiting for him, surrounded by attendants, which I can only assume would have been horrifyingly embarrassing for a teenager. Arthur lay down beside her, and all the rest retired, leaving the newlyweds alone. What happened next would prove to be the subject of serious litigation in several years' time. After the week-long revelry at Westminster, on November the 26th, the party packed up and moved to Henry's rebuilt palace at Richmond for the final stage in the festivities. The palace at Richmond was the real deal. It was the ultimate symbol of Henry Tudor's new dynasty. At the time, it must have been an amazing sight to behold. A massive red brick building that seemed to grow out of the Thames itself. It had giant bay windows and enormous domes that seemed to soar over the building itself. In every way, it was clean and airy. It included all the latest in early modern technology, even running water with taps. The party drifted through Richmond as if in a dream. The sculpted gardens contained mythical beasts cut from hedges and flowering trees. There were bowling alleys, archery ranges, and excellent tennis facilities. The party tarried there for a full 3 days. On November 29th, the party was over. Catherine, as negotiated, had been allowed to keep some of her Spanish retinue. The rest began the long journey home. Several days later, the couple left for Arthur's distant seat of Ludlow in the Welsh marches. Initially, Henry had intended to keep the royal couple with him in London for the first year of their marriage. But he changed his mind. Even in the face of protests from Ferdinand and Isabella, he remained firm. The couple should go. They needed to live on their own. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Late in the evening, on Monday, April 4th, 1502, a boat landed at Greenwich, where Henry and the royal household were in residence. It carried an urgent message from Ludlow. Henry had retired for the night, so one of his counselors opened the letter. The news was utterly devastating. Prince Arthur had died 48 hours previously. The Prince of Wales had taken ill nearly 2 months before, but his decline and death were swift and brutal. The likely cause was the so-named sweating sickness, a lethal flu-like virus whose symptoms included a raging temperature, convulsing intestinal pain, asphyxiation, and acute kidney failure. The counselors prevaricated, but ultimately decided not to wake the king. The next morning, one knocked discreetly on Henry's door and broke the news. His firstborn son, and heir to the throne, was dead. Camelot would not be reborn, after all. Henry was instantly distraught, but he sent for Elizabeth, who calmed him down. Amazingly, she took the news fairly well. Well, at least much better than Henry. She reminded him that he still had another son, and that they were both still young and could have more children. For the rest of the kingdom, Prince Arthur's death was as unexpected as it was shattering. Over the last decade and a half, England had grown accustomed to the idea of Henry and Elizabeth's first son as heir. Something that they had found even more easy to get used to, given Arthur's marriage to Catherine. At 15 years old, Arthur had been a man. Sure, Prince Henry still lived, but he was only 10 years old. And this remained an age notoriously fickle to children. Plus, off in the Low Countries, the pretender Earl of Suffolk remained at large. Over the previous few months, Henry's network of spies had been steadily working at the knot that was the Suffolk controversy. Again, as in the 1490s, what they found was as disappointing as it was shocking. Although Suffolk had fled with a handful of conspirators only, it turned out that he had a significant amount of support across the Channel. Suffolk, it seems, had fled England with a plan. From London, he went to the Dutch coast, and from there to Austria and the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. What was more, it turned out he had not fled at all. He had been invited. It was Maximilian who initially sought to use Warbeck against Henry. Now he was at it again. And there was more bad news. Several commanders in Calais. There were a few forts and walled cities, that's why I say several, had declared for Suffolk. Calais was crucial to England. Not only was holding the area a major source of English pride, it was, after all, the last remaining English enclave in France. It was also massively important economically. Calais was the heart of the English wool trade. The customs dues alone would be sufficient to pay for an army, as both Henry and Suffolk knew well. Henry acted quickly. As soon as he heard of Suffolk's defection, he sent messengers to the emperor to try to resolve the issue diplomatically. Henry had learned from his dealings with the emperor in the 1490s. Economic sanctions did very little to Maximilian. However, the emperor responded much better to economic carrots than sticks. The promise of financial aid did the trick before, perhaps it would now. Henry told Maximilian that he would loan him 10,000 pounds for his crusade against the Turks. In reality, Henry knew that he was giving Maximilian 10,000 pounds to fight the French, plus pay for an extremely expensive trip for Maximilian to Rome so he could finally be crowned. At first, negotiations went well, but then the English diplomats became increasingly frustrated as Maximilian kept shifting the goalposts. In the end, Maximilian proved to be too slippery of a fish for Henry's ambassadors to catch. He agreed that Suffolk would be banished from all of Maximilian's hereditary lands. But as to the myriad free cities of the empire, well, Maximilian was oh so sorry, but he could not do anything about the free imperial cities. So sad. The electors they would never consent. Oh, and it just so happened that Maximilian had only just sent Suffolk to one such free city. Aachen. Shucks, how that worked out, huh? Oh, but the 10,000 pounds? Yeah, Maximilian was still keeping that. Back home, Henry tried to do what he could to preempt any rebellion in England. To do so, he turned to his favorite weapon, money. Toward the end of 1499, Henry ordered his counselors to begin scrolling through the books, searching for anyone involved in a case of treason or concealing suspects. What he was looking for was anyone he could bind for a sum of money. Often nobles, but even some ordinary citizens, were required to post bonds or guarantee debts to ensure good behavior. Now, Henry decided that he would just call all the amounts due. But his next move was even more diabolical. Instead of assessing fines against men who had done something, he did the same for men who might do something in the future. In other words, Henry was now using bonds to guarantee good behavior. Men would not rebel because rebellion had just become too expensive. In fact, back in October, even as London was preparing for the royal wedding, Henry's agents were moving through Suffolk's home territory of East Anglia, armed with lists of the, quote, names of such persons as were servants of our rebel, end quote. Anyone who failed to appear when summoned was assumed to be guilty and was ordered to be committed to prison unless they could post a bond and would be held there until they could. Henry was playing the long game. At court, he spun his web, getting magnates to admit small discretions as though they were nothing, and then later on springing his trap, demanding a bond or imprisonment. In public, the records are replete with references to Henry as wearing a mask. No one could ever tell what he was thinking. Behind closed doors, he was meticulous and ruthless, going over his lists with a fine-toothed comb. He had even done this throughout his son's wedding. It was the perfect time to observe those whose loyalties had been called into question. He scrutinized his enemies until he was ready to move against them. But once ready, he sprung his trap without remorse. Henry and his counselors worked hard to disentangle rumors from evidence. The king continued to block off potential European safe houses for Suffolk as best he could, negotiating extradition treaties, all backed up with heavy financial inducements. Across the Channel in Calais, the situation remained tense. In October 1501, Henry reinforced the main fortress that was still loyal to him. His agents did their best to get the renegade lords of the other towers to surrender with promises of safe conduct. But most were not new to this game and refused to surrender. One such lord was tricked to leave his fortress, leaving his son in charge. No sooner was he out on a boat in the English Channel that several sailors grabbed him, and he was threatened with immediate drowning if he could not get his son to surrender the fortress. He did, and both father and son were tossed in the Tower of London. We know that in their case, Henry participated in their questioning personally, as was common for monarchs of the day. According to records, Henry's questioning method was consistent. He was meticulous and logical. Every question he asked was perfectly clear, so that the person being questioned understood exactly what was being asked of them. There was no room for evasion. Whether or not Henry had people tortured is unrecorded. However, if he didn't, then he would have been quite unique amongst the monarchs of the age. Whatever happened to father and son in that tower, somebody talked. In March, a detachment of royal soldiers swooped down on Portchester Castle, a strategically placed fortress on the Hampshire coast just outside Plymouth. The suspects were arrested, taken to nearby Winchester, and on March the 19th, summarily beheaded. Then in April came news of Arthur's death, and that was when things really started to snowball. On April 18th, William Courtenay, son of the Earl of Devon and Queen Elizabeth's brother-in-law, was arrested. His was the first well-known preemptive arrest. There was no evidence that Courtenay had done anything, only that he might. He was incarcerated pending the payment of a bond to secure his release. Soon, news of these preemptive detentions were swirling around London. On May the 2nd, the father and son who had been imprisoned in the Tower were beheaded. The technical crime that the father had been found guilty of was, insanely, the murder of the princes in the Tower. Did he do it? Almost certainly not. But did it matter? Absolutely not. Over this rash of punishment and execution, loomed the shadow of Arthur's death. His body was embalmed and placed in Ludlow Castle until April 23rd, when the royal family arrived for the funeral. I don't think that there's any reason to doubt that Arthur's death played a major role in Henry's change in attitude. Certainly, it coincided with Suffolk's escape, but the reality is that Arthur's death shook his father to his core. The Tudor dynasty meant everything to Henry. He would spend literally his entire reign endeavoring to protect it. And seeing his son die meant that no matter what he did, he could not control everything. In the end, Henry responded to this reality that we all must face at some point in our lives by trying desperately to control everything he could. Henry became the ultimate micromanaging monarch. And again, his preference was to control people using the ultimate symbol of control, currency. Back in Aachen, Suffolk was not slow to grasp the significance of the situation. Arthur's death presented him with an opportunity. He wrote furiously to Emperor Maximilian. Now was the time to strike, with the royal family in disarray. This was his chance to return to England and confront the king. But the emperor did not respond. Suffolk, in fact, had heard little from the emperor over the preceding months and was beginning to think that something might not be right. He was right to be suspicious. Maximilian was never interested in turning Suffolk over to Henry. That would mean losing his cash cow. But neither was he interested in bankrolling an attempted invasion of England. That also would result in him losing his cash cow. No. Maximilian liked Suffolk right where he had him. And so Suffolk was stuck cooling his heels in Aachen. Henry placed spies throughout Europe to continue to track his movements, if any. If Suffolk left the safety of any of the German cities, then Henry was determined to get him. And back in England, Henry continued shoring up his position. He instructed his spies and ministers to try to turn as many of Suffolk's men as he could. Offer them royal pardons, he commanded. Anything to get them to give up their positions and give up the names of other conspirators. After all, he could always just assess a bond to them later on to, secure their loyalty. Even at the heart of all this espionage, if you look deep enough, you would find cold, hard cash. Henry was using money to encourage Maximilian to get in line. All his spies were ready to hand out bribes if those secured arrests or more information. Huge amounts of cash flowed through Italian banks in London and on to the continent, where his spies withdrew the same funds in Vienna, Paris, Brussels, and Milan. Henry's international espionage was only made possible by international banking. Now Henry was not just giving his money away. He expected to get full value. He had already given Maximilian £10,000, and he was determined that he should get something for that investment. That, though, belied the reality both he and Maximilian knew. With Arthur's death, Suffolk's value increased exponentially. Suffolk knew it too. In another letter, he tried to impress upon the emperor the enormity of the situation. The only figure that now remained between Suffolk and the crown was Prince Henry. If Henry VII died without an heir, then there would be no doubt whatsoever as to who would be next in line. So, Suffolk suggested, not too slyly either, if something were to, happen to the young prince, well, who's to say? Meanwhile, back in Ludlow, Catherine had not gone with the funeral procession to Worcester. She was still grievously ill, likely with the same sweating sickness that had killed Arthur. She was carried slowly back to London in a litter sent by a kind-hearted Queen Elizabeth. Obviously, it was natural for Henry to be concerned for the health of his daughter-in-law. But beyond natural concern, there was some suspicion that Catherine might also be pregnant, and therefore carrying the heir to the throne. That would have meant that, as mother to the future king, Catherine would still have held a major position within the royal family. But she was not pregnant. Now she was officially a third wheel. Prince Henry was heir to the throne, and she was just another widow in 16th century England. Most of the focus after Prince Arthur's death focuses on King Henry, and rightly so, since he was the King of England, and Arthur's death impacted his kingship. However, I don't think that anybody was more impacted by the death of Arthur than Catherine. Suddenly, she had no position at court at all, and frankly, no prospects. Ferdinand and Isabella wrote frantically to de Puebla, their ambassador at court, asserting that they expected Henry to fulfill his expectations to their daughter, including giving her dower lands and estates due to her as a widow. If he did not, then Catherine would have no income, and she'd be unable to meet even her basic household expenses. They were sure the king would not break his word, especially while Catherine was overcome with grief at losing her prince. All these letters, to be honest, actually indicate the opposite of what they say. The Spanish monarchs had less than zero faith that Henry was going to keep his word. In fact, they heard through de Puebla, presumably, that people close to Catherine were already advising her to sell her jewels to cover her expenses. The Spanish monarchs sent messages to de Puebla to tell Catherine to prepare for a return voyage home. The English experiment was at an end. But again, this is mostly diplomatic subterfuge. Now that Catherine was conclusively not pregnant, she was a hot commodity once more on the European marriage market. Her parents fully intended to get their full value. Far from wanting their daughter shipped home, Ferdinand and Isabella were keen that she should marry the Prince of Wales. I mean, the new one, right away. There were reasons for this. Back in France, Louis XII had picked up where Charles had left off and re-invaded northern Italy, which at this point was little more than a pawn in the ongoing battle between France and Spain for European domination. Louis XII was once again intent on dominating Naples, which, for the moment, remained a Spanish possession. To put this into context, all this is going on during the Borgia papacy, while Cesare Borgia was trying to mop up Romagna. So yeah, there's a lot going on in Italy. Fearing complete French domination of Italy, Ferdinand and Isabella were now desperate to get Henry to attack France and draw his attention away from the Italian boot. A new marriage alliance seemed just the way to do it. Eager to prove their worth, the Spanish began putting pressure on Maximilian to give up Suffolk. Henry, though, paused. And so this kind of begins a new phase in Henry's reign. Henry was determined to exert his power on the continent, and he wanted to use his children to do it. He didn't care at all about platitudes or praises. He wanted the most bang for his buck. And he was willing to use his children, plus Catherine, as bargaining chips to do it. Henry was in a strong position to negotiate right now, and he wasn't in a hurry. By fall, Ferdinand and Isabella had dropped the high-pressure sales job. Now they instructed de Puebla to ease off the whole invade France right now idea. His marching orders became secure a marriage contract between Prince Henry and Catherine, no matter what. If that turned into a future alliance against France, so be it. But they certainly understood the truth of Shakespeare's famous quotation from King Lear. Nothing will come from nothing. If they overplayed their hand now, they might marry Catherine to anybody. After all, Henry had possession of Catherine. She was his daughter-in-law, kinda. Technically, it was his duty to provide for her. So he could keep her as long as he wanted. They had to be careful. And in the end, Queen Elizabeth's words of comfort to Henry proved prescient. She was pregnant again. Next time, Prince Henry steps into his brother's shoes, while King Henry's reign takes a dark and sinister turn. If you're interested in more content, check out the website, westerncivpodcast.com. To support the show, and for ad-free versions plus bonus content, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast. And if you want the whole story over again, but with better audio quality and more detail, check out the subscriber feed at glow.fm/Western Civ.